Thank you all for coming. Today we actually have Lieutenant Colonel Ayers. He's very gracious to speak to us today about the issue of terrorism, and particularly from a U.S. military perspective. Colonel Ayers is presently at Fort Leavenworth, and he's one of many that he's a political scientist, so we're very happy to have somebody of his caliber talk about terrorism today. Without any further...
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. How are we doing today? Great. Doing okay? Great. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come down and just have a discussion today about, we talk about a couple different topics. Again, my name is Nick Ayers. I'm currently at Fort Leavenworth. I'm a Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Army. I'm coming up on about 20 years of service this spring, so it's been a little while, but it's been fun. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about myself, because ultimately what I want to be able to do is answer any questions that you guys have and have to discuss about the things that you want to talk about, rather than me just talk for an hour or whatever, and then you walk away and maybe there's something you'd rather know about. I'm an Army officer, and by trade I was trained on tanks, so that's kind of what I began doing, was being on tanks and doing that. I've been able to have a lot of different experiences. So when I was younger, I got to go to Germany, spent some time in Europe, went to Kosovo. Later on, went to Iraq in 03 and 04 in the wonderful town of Ramadi, which really wasn't that wonderful. Then later on, got to do some academic assignments. So I went to grad school and then got to teach out at Stanford. And then from there, went to the United States Military Academy and taught political science out there. I taught classes in political science, comparative politics, and then terrorism. Went back to the Army and went to go be part of a unit that went to Afghanistan. Spent a year in Afghanistan in Kandahar. Came back and currently I'm teaching at the Army's Command and General Staff College, which is at Fort Leavenworth. And that is kind of our mid-grade officer leadership course. So the folks we have going through there have been in the Army for about 10 years, and they're getting ready to go into kind of CEO, COO positions. And I teach classes on planning, leadership, ethics, and terrorism there. So that's kind of a little bit about what I do from a military standpoint. I also have 4 kids, which I only point that out because having 4 kids, I realized I probably should have stopped at 2. I was a much better dad at 2 than 4. So a lot of my time I find is just trying to manage them, and they keep me in check, because it's one thing when you go to your job and everyone says yes sir, no sir, and they do your stuff, and then the kids look at you and you tell them to do stuff and they laugh and they walk away. So it's always nice to have that humility in check, and my kids do that for me every day. What we're going to talk a little bit about is terrorism, and again, we can take this a bunch of different ways. And I've got some slides initially done up to talk about a couple topics, and then, like I said, I'm interested to hear your thoughts and your perspectives. And it's probably a little bit of a misnomer, because I say understanding terrorism, just like, hey, guess what? You can come for about an hour and understand terrorism. And it's much more complicated than that, and I think most people know that. So I don't pretend to know all the answers. I've spent some time doing some studies on this. I've spent some time doing this out in the field. I've got to go and talk at a lot of different places, whether it was in the Army or going to some different colleges like Harvard and Yale and other places to go just have these kind of discussions. But hopefully I can add something to the conversation. So just a couple things we'll talk about. I'll give a few overall thoughts. We'll talk a little bit about strategies versus tactics, because sometimes those get intermixed, and it matters, because as we talk about what we do from a government perspective or from a military standpoint, it's important whether we're distinguishing between strategies or tactics, because they can be mixed up. We'll talk a little bit about trending, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about ISIS, because it's the kind of topic of the day, and we'll kind of go from there, and then I'll really get your questions, and we can talk about what you want to talk about. And I will point out, I did have the disclaimer at the very beginning. I'm in the Army. I've been disguised today because, as you can probably guess, it's kind of a touchy subject whenever we're talking about policies and everything abroad. So everything I kind of say today is just my perspective as of someone that's been in the military and from an academic perspective. But please don't mistake anything I say as terms of, hey, this is policy, or you walk away and go, hey, this guy said we're going to do this, and I'm not trying to give that impression. So a couple things about terrorism in general. It's interesting in the literature because there's a lot of time spent on defining terrorism. Like, Like you can take a class on terrorism and spend an entire course just debating what should be terrorism, what's not, and it's kind of frustrating to me to see that, because I think there's so many good topics to have rather than getting lost in the conversation. So I'll just say from this standpoint, what I kind of look at in terms of terrorism and the way I've kind of defined it is just this. It's just acts or threats of violence by non-state actors to achieve a political objective. And that seems to be a working definition. Some people will look in there and they'll say, no, it should be, not necessarily political objectives, should be social objectives. And I'm like, okay, that's great too. Or, should it be non-state actors or can it be state actors? I'm like, I guess so, but you can also have, then you kind of muddle the ground in terms if you don't have a non-state actor and it can be any actor, then it's like, well, if we conduct a war, is that terrorism? If it's by a state, it's like, well, I guess you could, from your perspective, you could look at that. But for this, we're just going to kind of use non-state actors. I think the political objective, though, is an important qualifier, because if it's just acts or threats of violence by a non-state actor, but you don't have a political objective, then what does that become? It's just like crime. It's just violence. So in order to discern that from just general violence, I think the political objective part is important. The next part is in terms of there's three lenses, and this is something I've kind of come to find. So when you look at terrorism, there's three ways you can kind of define that, or the academia kind of looks at it. One is from an organizational perspective. So there's some researchers that really like to look at organizations. How does Al-Qaeda, how do they operate? How does ISIS recruit? How does organizations like FARC, how did they get their money? So that's one way that academics like to look at it. Another one is individually. So these are guys like Mark Sageman or Martha Crenshaw who like to look at what are the characteristics of the individual terrorist? What are the characteristics that motivate the individual to join the organization? And then the last one is more structural. So this is like more of the macro factors that are in a country that would affect why terrorism might be. So these would be things like poverty or levels of education, or it might be in terms of the terrain. Like we might say, if there's a country that has really, really mountainous terrain or complex terrain that would be really hard for a government to secure, then you're more likely to get those kind of actors. And so those are kind of the three ways that they go. And I've given some examples that are there. But I focus most of my effort on probably the lower two. So most of my research has not been on the individual, although I think that's interesting. Generally, individuals don't conduct terrorism absent an organization or absent the conditions which allow that organization to take hold. Because part of what generates violence from the individual perspective is kind of individual motivations. And there's a guy named Ted Gurr who wrote a book called Why Men Rebel. I don't know if anyone's ever familiar with that book, but it's this kind of seminal book he did. And he said, at the end of the day, the reason why people conduct violence is because they have what he called a sense of relative deprivation, which just meant people get mad about what they have and they think they should be doing better. Because there's a lot of bad things in the world, but unless people think that they can achieve something better or there's the potential for something better, then they normally don't actually go to violence. And that's why he argued that in places where you have extreme poverty, like think about desolate nations. So I've been in some pretty poor places. But let's say take a country like Ethiopia. People there might be destitute, might be living very conditions. But if they don't have an expectation that their life should be better, then they generally don't take up arms. Because they just go, life sucks, that's too bad, but it's not going to get better. But when you have this notion that life should be better, and this can be spurred on by rises of technology, could be spurred on by rise of communication, by intermixing populations, then all of a sudden people start saying, oh, we should do something about this. The last part about this is terrorism is a battle for audiences. So I'm going to do some really poor drawing here on I'll do it on, whiteboard I'll do it on. So I try to think of what goes on with terrorism. I love there's whiteboards here. I'll whiteboard the death to things. I was so proud when all my kids got their first whiteboard, and I just have them carried around their neck, and I write little tasks for them. They come home, like, Dad, I got my first whiteboard. I'm like, awesome. So you have this battle of audiences, right? And it's like a clean whiteboard, which is great. I don't know if anyone's ever written on this, so I guess be the first, right? So we got So we got two different sides, right? So did I put the sad? I probably should make them not sad. Probably should make them angry. Whoops, this way. And so if this is your terrorist and this is your government, right? There's a battle going on. And this is a big part of when we look at terrorist actions and we try to figure out what's going on. To me, this is kind of how I thought about it. So, right, you've got the struggle between the two. But at the end of the day, terrorism really is not, it's a direct fight, but there's really this constituency fight. And so there's people that these organizations are talking to. So who could they be talking to? So a lot of times, this organization here has got people down here, right? Their constituency. The constituency likes this organization. You've also got people down here that like the government. You've also got people in the middle who are like, I don't know which way I support. Maybe I like them, maybe I like them. And so a lot of times the actions that people are doing are geared toward different audiences. So for instance, if there's a terrorist bombing in a country, we might say, oh, that bombing is really bad. But then the question is, well, who was that bombing meant for? Who was the message for? Was this organization trying to talk to this audience, trying to say, hey, your government can't protect you? Was the terrorist trying to talk to this population which says, hey, we just did this bombing, we're going to win this, come support us? Were they trying to talk to this audience? Or are there outside audiences that are all looking at this? And so maybe this is other non-state actors that they might be looking to join, or there might be other organizations out here that they're competing with. Or you've got other countries over here that are watching what's going on here and they're saying, oh, we should do what this government's doing and resist. Or this organization really doesn't care what this government does, but they're trying to get this government not to join in. Like, hey, we did this bombing, and if you come join the fight, you're getting bombed too. And so all these different audiences all play into different strategies, and that's kind of where we're going to go next. Because a lot of times from a counter perspective, we misinterpret what the strategy actually is. We think we know what it is, but we actually don't know. And a lot of times, even if we think we know, it's hard for us to know for certain. So a lot of times we use these words, strategies and tactics, interchangeably. We'd be like, oh, the tactic of whatever, or we're looking at the strategy. But they mean different things. So from a strategic perspective, there are 5 general strategies that have kind of been laid out in the terrorism literature. And I don't know if you guys have read about this or come across this, but this Barbara Walter and Andrew Kidd are two, they work out on the West Coast, one's at UCLA and one's at UCSD. And they said there's 5 general strategies that terrorist organizations employ. And these are the 5. They said strategies either are about intimidation, provocation, attrition, spoiling, and outbidding. And so what they mean by that is, and this goes back to my wonderful drawing, which I spent a lot of time on. I mean, this is like the perfection of like after 6 of these, or 7 of these. I mean, this is how good it gets. But intimidation is all about intimidating the government and the government's constituency, right? Hey, you better quit, and so we're going to conduct a lot of violence to get you to quit. Provocation is actually the opposite. So this is the story about 9/11, right? So people debate about this. Was 9/11 all about getting the U.S. to pull out of the Middle East, or was it about getting us to jump in? I don't know. I mean, if your goal is to have an Islamic caliphate, do you get that by the U.S. pulling out of Saudi Arabia, as per bin Laden's original desires to get the U.S. out of Saudi Arabia? Or is it about, hey, we need to get the Super Bowl going of, terrorism? And the only way to do that is bring the U.S. to us. And what better to do that in order to get the Twin Towers down, provoke the U.S. from responding, get us to overreact, and then all of a sudden, now that one action is not only getting these people to jump in, but everybody else. In fact, I would submit, can we imagine on September 12th, 2001, for those of us that kind of remember that, the U.S. backing off? Was that even an option? At that point, we were going after somebody. It didn't even matter who it was. It was like somebody's going to pay. And so that would be the provocation story. The attrition strategy is just, hey, we're going to whittle them down. This is just, hey, we're just going to cause a lot of violence. Eventually the government's going to be like, all right, we give in, you get your political objective. These last 2 are a little bit interesting because spoiling is specifically done to try to undermine efforts being done elsewise. So this would be the case of the second Intifada, where you had the Oslo Accords that were being done between Israel and Hamas and Palestinian Jihad. And so what you had was peace accords were going on, and all of a sudden there were groups that did attacks to try to spoil the peace efforts. So they wanted to continue the fight. This last one is about outbidding. And this audience is all about this terrorist organization trying to compete with other competing terrorist organizations for the same constituency, because generally everyone wants to pick a winner. So, you get into March Madness and you're watching basketball, it's always nice to root for the underdog. Everyone's voting for the Cinderella story. But when it's like real, like people are dying, nobody wants to normally pick the Cinderella. Generally, everyone's picking the winner. Everyone's picking Duke to win it because, hey, if I'm going to join, I'm going to join the winner. And so in the outbidding strategy, groups are competing not for getting the government to give up, but what they're doing is they're competing against other organizations. And so this was seen a lot of times in Israel. This has been seen previously. And the way that we know this is happening is because attacks are being done and multiple groups are taking claim. Like, hey, I did the attack. And there's other groups like, no, we did the attack. And the other groups say, no, we did the attack. And they know that it was outbidding, and this is Mia Bloom is the author that says this, because what is Israel's normal response for a terrorist attack? They bulldoze the home of the terrorist family. They launch missiles, like the helicopter strike. So there's a pretty good cost for taking responsibility for the attack. Yeah, groups do it all the time. And so when you have multiple groups competing, that's we would know. And so this all matters because it affects our counter strategy. So if it's all about outbidding, if you have multiple groups that are competing for the same constituency, then our response possibly should be to help out certain groups, since they're really competing against each other for the same constituency. And there seems to be that the audience all likes these organizations because the groups think there's a market for this constituency. So what I mean by that is, if this is all a battle for hearts and minds, and these are the groups that, these civilians here, we don't want them joining the organization, right? It would be nice if they didn't. And we certainly don't want these guys to join the organization. That if we think that there's multiple groups all competing for this group, that means the group likes these organizations. There's some social goods that they're offering, whether it's schools or education or protection or something else. When these groups here are not talking to this audience, meaning groups like, let's say, Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2006 were not offering any social goods to the population and were seemingly killing members of the population writ large, that should have signaled to us that what was going on was a strategy of either intimidation or a strategy of recruitment that was aimed outside of the country. That they weren't talking to the people of Iraq, that Al-Qaeda had given up, that they said there was no way that they could get this constituency here on their side, and so instead they were just willing to kill whoever they needed to. And we have pretty good evidence that that's actually the case, given on some of the stuff that we've recovered. That this was an area that this group had given up on, and really what they were trying to compete with was other groups outside the country, or they were trying to get international recruits. Tactics, on the other hand, are just a means by which we accomplish a strategy. So one of the most well-known tactics that gets used is suicide bombings, right? I've spent an inordinate amount of time studying suicide bombings, and I can talk about suicide bombings for more time than probably anyone would be willing to hear. But at the end of the day, there's a question of whether that's a strategy or whether it's just a tactic. Is it just a means in order to achieve one of these other things? And should we just treat it as a tactic? Or is it its own inherent strategy? And that's this part here. And like I said, in the question and answer period, I can talk about this more if anyone's interested. But a lot of times we spend time getting really concerned about suicide bombers. We're concerned about things like 9/11. And at the end of the day, if we determine that it's really just a tactic, that it's just something that they're using because it's effective, then we don't have to spend as much time worrying about that. We should spend more time worrying about the overall strategy involved and less time worried about the individual tactic that someone uses. Because if we can figure out a way to counter the use of suicide bombing, that's great. They'll just use something else. So that's how I just kind of look at it as a means to the end. So as a trend, so this is kind of surprising, but in the last 40, what are we at, almost 50 years, the volume of attacks throughout the world has actually decreased. And that's according to several different databases. So that is according to the Iterate database, that is according to the RAND database, which is the RAND MIPT database. There's a lot of different databases that all show this. Now the problem is this second point, that although terrorist attacks are decreasing, the proportion of those attacks which causes casualties is increasing. And that's because a lot of the attacks that were counted a long time ago were done to destroy property. So these databases that look at attacks would be like, okay, we're going to detect arson, or we're going to detect property damage. A lot of groups that operated in Europe were more interested in causing property damage and would actually call ahead and say, oh, by the way, there's going to be an attack on Sunday at 4 p.m. Make sure no one's in the mall. Okay, great. That doesn't happen so much anymore. We do see a trend towards softer targets. So there's a word in literature that talks about hardening. So as we harden targets against things like suicide bombers, there seems to be a trend to shift toward softer ones, and that makes tactical sense. And then the last things is that counterterrorist policies can push organizations to make different tactical decisions without affecting the strategy. So what do I mean by that is, we've been really good sometimes at coming out with ways to counter tactics, but that's where we spend a lot of our time. So we worry about things like, say in Iraq, we worry a lot about IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And we spend an inordinate amount of time and resources coming out ways to counter IEDs. The problem is we don't spend time countering the strategy. So all we do is we make it really, really hard for them to put in IEDs. That's great. I mean, I'm all for stopping that. But the organization still exists, and they just find other ways. In the I guess it was about the mid-2000s, there was a string of kidnappings that happened in Iraq. It was the tactic of the day. They started kidnapping journalists all over the place and kidnapping Western workers. They did that for about 6 months. And then all of a sudden that strategy stopped working, or the tactic stopped working. Partly because they weren't being as successful, partly because there were some organizations that stopped paying, also because we started finding them, and so they stopped using that tactic. Strategy still existed though. So it's really important as we think from a counter perspective, in my opinion, that we work more toward the strategy than the tactic piece. There are a couple slides that I had in terms of some charts, but I'm just going to push through those real quick because they just show the trend. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about ISIS. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Ori Brofman. He wrote this book called Starfish and the Spider. So it's this kind of cool book. It's not that long. But he has this idea about organizations, and he classifies organizations really generally as either a starfish or as a spider. And so what he means by that is he says there are some organizations which are set up as a spider. And if they're a spider, you can cut off the head and it dies. And there are other organizations that are built like a starfish, where they're somewhat, you could cut off one limb and they kind of regrow, or the starfish continues to live. And he gives a lot of examples of why that's the case, and he talks about the challenges. But ISIS has both. They have built themselves into kind of a spider network in Syria and Iraq, where they've got a headquarters. It's in Raqqa. They pull financial resources from oil and taxation, mostly in Mosul and other places. But then they have this starfish aspect, which I don't even think was intentional initially. But it's the starfish aspect which recruits individuals from abroad that they have almost no control over. And that's the idea behind the starfish, is that with Ori Brofman, he says these organizations are very hard to stop because they just spontaneously set up throughout the world. And he uses some examples with, he actually uses music as a big example, but he talks about the industry that started copying music, like Napster and all these others, just kind of grew, and the more and more the music industry tried to shut them down, these little like hacker organizations just kept coming up with different ways, and it became almost impossible to stop because you never knew where they were going to pop up. And so the starfish aspect are individuals that are reading propaganda online, and they're just kind of spontaneously saying, I want to do attack for ISIS. And ISIS is like not controlling them, and they're just like willing to take credit for it. So you got these two parts of it. There's a recruitment narrative that we often play into, right? So the narrative behind ISIS is that the big bad West is coming for us, and we need to set up, the Ummah, the caliphate, to defend, and we have to do this, and we can do it now. And a lot of times, our counter-terrorist policies play into that narrative, and they either play it into it in the Middle East, or they play into the starfish aspect, because what we put out feeds into this individual perception of the West is out to get the caliphate or is against us. And if you remember back when I talked about this idea of relative deprivation, it all is about the individual. So if the individual believes that they should be doing better and that life sucks and that they can do something about it, that's when they rebel. And so that's why it's hard to do it. Perceptions are really big, so it doesn't really matter what's actually true. In fact, I kind of view, there's this kind of view of the world which talks about capital T and little t truth. I don't know if anyone's ever heard this view. It's a very simplistic idea. But capital T truth is like what's actually true, like really, really true. Like there's no doubt. Little t truth is like everything that we actually believe. And then you have like a little t like sub A. It's like the truth according to Ayers. It's what I believe to be true, but it's like not would actually be true. We all have these. There's like little sub Bill, little sub Charles, all these little sub t's. And so it really doesn't matter what's capital T truth. It just matters what these little t's are. And changing those is really, really hard. The other part is ISIS is experienced. So one of the things that helps us a lot of times when we're going against terrorist organizations is that it's their first time. They're like learning on the fly. ISIS is not that. And although there's this famous quote where they were called the JV and everything else, the reality is they started from a lot of other organizations which already existed. And unfortunately, with terrorist networks, you'll see a lot of the same characters popping up. The Chechens have been famous for this. They kind of show up where all the trouble spots are, but they've been doing this for a long time. So they're just like, okay, we'll go fight here. Okay, we'll go fight here. And every time they go, they get a little better. Geographically dispersed. And the last part is they're technologically savvy. And they've been very good about kind of using the virtual space in order to do recruitment efforts. And it's been hard to combat that. So the last part I'll talk about is just some of the challenges that they present and then kind of what we can do about it. So again, oops, sorry. There. So what do we do, right? So what options exist? So we go back to those three lenses. So from an organizational perspective, we can target the organization structure. We can certainly do that. We can certainly go after individuals or systems or resources, go after the finances, find individual X and try to go after them. The longstanding joke in the terrorist research community was, or the military community was, what's the worst position to have in a terrorist organization? And it's like the third in charge, because he was always seeming to get killed. I mean, every time we killed somebody, it was always like, we killed the number 3 guy. It's like, we can never kill the number 2, but always kill number 3. We can reduce the available safe spaces. So countries that are kind of have a very weak or dysfunctional government are generally those safe places. So where are those places in the world? Well, places like Yemen is a kind of a safe place. Afghanistan existed as a safe place. Syria currently exists as a safe place. So these are kind of the governments that don't have the capacity to secure the whole area. From a structural perspective, the state's capacity for governance and civil security, we can do things to do that. So we can help a government govern better. We can help a country get better property rights or better judicial systems. And we can also affect some of these systemic factors, level of education, poverty, industrialization. We can do some things there. The last part is from the individual perspective. And this is probably the hardest one to affect because it's really hard to change people's perceptions. Their little t truth, like, I mean, I could sit all day long and lecture someone, but that's going to be really hard to change. So understanding what these little t truths are and acknowledging that and not discrediting it. Not be like, well, this person here, they have their little t truth, but that's completely, illegitimate. Like just discrediting and saying, well, they don't know what they're talking about. It's like, well, I mean, they think they know what they're talking about. So trying to provide an alternate narrative to affect the support of the constituency. And this is tough, and we don't do a really good job at this. This is like, when parents try to talk to their kids, and the kids are like, man, you're not cool. And the parents think they're cool. The parents are like trying to like use the lingo of the day. Like last night, we threw my daughter threw a high school party for Halloween. It was like our first one. And the entire time, our best thing we could do was just like stay out of the way, because we knew any attempt we would make to engage with them and talk with them would be viewed as Mom, Dad. I think at one point my wife walked out and was like, hey, you guys doing okay? And my daughter just rolled her eyes. It's like, why are you even talking to me? Well, unfortunately, that's kind of what happens when you try to talk to these groups. When we try to engage with these constituencies and the US government comes in, it's like, why are you talking to us? And it's like, no, I'm cool like you. We try to get these spokesmen. When I was in Afghanistan, we were in Kandahar, and I had a commander who had this brilliant idea. Really wasn't that brilliant, but it was a brilliant idea. That, hey, in order to talk to these people and try to get them to push away from the Taliban, it would be really great if we could have some rock stars. And his idea of the rock stars was using the Mujahideen. So he said, these former fighters, former Mujahideen guys who fought against the Soviets in the 1980s, and let's bring them in. If we can bring them in, then they can give us some street credibility, and they can talk to the locals and get them to convince that, hey, the Taliban's not the way to go. Let's support the Afghan government. Sounds great, except the area that I was at was not supportive of the Mujahideen. They were actually pro-Soviet. And so the person that we work for, we tried to tell them this and explain that, hey, that works great in lots of places of the country, but in Kandahar and Maiwan district, they were not pro-Mujahideen. Like, because of the terrain, it was basically open desert, and so the Soviets were able to use helicopters and other places to secure. So we tried to say, hey, if you really want to do that, you need to bring in these guys that actually fought for the Soviets. Did not go over well. I wasn't able to affect the little T-truth of my boss, or my boss's boss, but it's hard to do. And the last one is providing alternative mechanisms. So if you have this relative deprivation and you get people that are unhappy and you get people that want to rise up and make their life better, then what alternatives do they have? And you've got to give them those. Because a lot of times we don't want to give them those alternatives because we're afraid of the results. Like, if we let people vote, what will they actually choose? I mean, we have that own problem in our own country, right? So now we're talking about another country. So there's ways that we can affect this, but it's hard. Okay, so I've talked for probably way too long. So what I'm more interested, though, is what your questions or your perspectives that you have. And I'm happy to answer whatever I can or give you my thoughts on it. Yep. Yeah, please.
My first one is you talked about the suicide bombings being a tactic versus strategy. And I understood the tactic part, but what I want to know is if it was a strategy, what would the strategy be?
No, that's great. Okay. So there's a lot of folks that have wrote about this. And in 2005, this guy named Robert Pape wrote this very, very he got a lot of publicity. And what he talked about is the strategic logic of suicide bombings. And the idea was that suicide bombing was kind of an intimidation strategy in his mind. But what it was supposed to signal is not only are we going to kill a lot of people, but we're going to show that our constituency is so motivated that we've got people willing to die for their cause. That's how strong we are. If I have the option between two bombings, right? So I've got option A and option B. Both of them kill 100 people. And I apologize, I'm not trying to flippantly talk about killing 100 people, but just giving an example. I mean, it's just kind of the reality of life, right? I can do a bomb, I've got two choices. Both kill 100 people, but one is suicide in nature and one is not. By doing this, it sends an extra signal. There's this intrinsic value of a suicide bomb that either scares this constituency, goes, holy crap, I could get killed in a suicide bomb, or it sends a signal that these folks are so motivated that they're willing to blow themselves up, even when we don't even have to. The other thing it can do, and this is Mia Bloom writes about this in terms of a strategy, is the outbidding story. And she tries to use the example that suicide bombings in Israel were used as a way to strategically outbid other groups. That hey, we're so good, we're the #1 team, don't join that other terrorist organization, join us. And the way we can demonstrate that is we do suicide bombings. And in there, they did a lot of polling data, and they found that the population in general liked it. So that's how it could be used as a strategy, that you could use it to either intimidate, you could use it to recruit, or you could use it to kind of outbid others. Just the fact that it's a suicide bomb. Yep. I'm sorry. Oh, okay, that's okay. I thought you might have a question. That's all right. I'm sorry. You don't have to ask a question. I thought you had your hand up. No, you're good. You're good. Yep. Yeah, please.
Okay. My second question is conspiracy theories.
Okay.
And
they don't exist. No.
Why do you think people come up with conspiracy theories? Why do you think, this is just me,
That's okay.
being curious, why do you think that they exist, and what are your extra thoughts on them?
Do you have an example of a conspiracy theory that?
The 9/11 one.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with this, right? Because we have our own little T-truth, and so we try to find evidence which confirms that. And sometimes when the evidence doesn't necessarily confirm that, we find other evidence to support that. So I think that's a lot of times why those sorts of ideas persist.
Do you think that by the conspiracy theories existing, it's some sort of a way that the terrorists are winning?
Well, I think that I don't think the fact that conspiracy theories exist would affect the ultimate outcome. I mean, because I think those kind of doubts, I think you could probably go throughout time. There's conspiracy theories or skepticism which exists about, incidents, whether we landed on the moon or, whatever. But what I think it does is it shows that there's a wide range of narratives which exist to explain an instance. And when we think that there's only one, that's when I think we're run up in challenges. When we don't acknowledge that there are others, that we have to reach those. So, if there's a dissatisfied population, whether it's a domestic population which believes in conspiracy theory, or it's a population that's here in a country that has serious doubts about whether their government can provide for their security, we have to target that, and we have to show through actions and words that belief is maybe not necessarily true, or try to do something to change it. So I don't think necessarily the presence of it, but I do think it can undermine efforts. And I think we sometimes dismiss those out of hand. We just go, oh, that's just a crazy conspiracy theory. Or, well, of course this population should see that, we're supporting us. I'll give you another example in Afghanistan. So there's a big debate when you talk about Afghanistan with what to do with illicit drugs, like poppies. Like, what do you do with them? And there's one side of the fence that says, well, we need to eradicate poppies because they're used to make heroin, they're taxed by the Taliban, they're then exported out and they're used those funds to buy weapons or fund their efforts. That is a strategy. I mean, you can do that. There's another side that says, well, if you do that, you're really disenfranchising that middle population because they depend on that for their income. It's like, I've been to Afghanistan. You can grow certain things. Poppies happen to grow really well. So does marijuana. Both of them grow extremely well. Things like rice don't grow as well because they require too much water. And there's also not markets set up. But we sometimes discount and we just say, well, if we provide them wheat seed, of course they'll grow wheat because they'll want to grow wheat. And we try to say, well, maybe, but who are they going to sell the wheat to? If all of them are growing wheat, are they going to sell wheat to each other? It's like, hey, I'll sell you wheat. That's okay. I've got my own wheat because. So it's not a product to really sell for money, and they have to make money. So sometimes there's some other approaches you could do with that, where you buy it, use it for medicinal purposes, tax it, try to control it that way, and take it out of the hands of the Taliban and try to put it in the hands of the government. This is the idea behind legalizing drugs overall. It's like get it out of the illicit nature, get the government in control of it. Therefore, we can try to get that part of the market out. But sometimes it doesn't fit in with the idea. Yes, sir.
A question. You go to an Army recruit and discuss joining the service. All the benefits are mentioned as to what your career will lead to and what you'll be able to do after you join the service. My question to you is, what type of recruitment, what benefits are mentioned or discussed or promised to an individual that does join ISIS or any group that is a terrorist group? Things like martyrdom, heaven.
Are you talking about recruitment?
Knowledge, and ability to have your sons and martyrdom. So maybe at this point to categorize what are the chief points that they tell their recruits?
So excellent question. So the question, I think, as I understand, is about recruitment and incentives to join. So there's a lot of different incentives that have been talked about. And especially when you talk about martyrdom, because that's the one that a lot of times people, again, not to make it about suicide bombing, but I spent a lot of time researching this. It's like, what motivates someone to like give their life? Because if it's all about achieving a political objective and you're knowingly not going to be around, like that motivation must be pretty good because you're willing to give your life up. I'm in the service. We all join and we say, hey, we're willing to put our lives on the line, but we don't want, we want to come back. You have these people that are not wanting to give up. So there's different incentives, right? So the one a lot of times people point to is money, right? There's a woman named, her last name is Hassan, her first name starts with an N, and I'll remember it here at the end. But she was a UN worker in Palestine, and what she did was she went around a lot of camps and she asked these questions about recruitment, and what she found was money was generally one of the least influencing factors. Money was generally not involved at all. In fact, most suicide bombers in their case, are actually fairly well educated, normally come from middle class families. And that makes sense for a couple different reasons. Number one is when you talk about relative deprivation, not to go back to that, but it's all about thinking you could do better. So a lot of times you have professionals that had a job, they've got families, they've got responsibilities, they've experienced some success in their life, and then that ends. And then they go, now what? And there's this feeling of dissatisfaction. They're generally fairly motivated individuals, and those a lot of times are the people that end up being martyrs. In fact, most times, the majority, that's actually the case. It also makes sense from an organization standpoint. So terrorist organizations, one of their biggest assets is the fact they operate in the shadows. Like they're stealthy. Like they don't have signs out front that says, you know, Al-Qaeda's here. Now, in ISIS they have, and that's what makes them sort of a spider network, which I think will ultimately work against them because they've actually tried to provide themselves a base of operations, which we can target. Like those organizations are suddenly the easiest to get rid of because there's a sign that says this is where they're at. Now, there's the complication of having to deal with civilian casualties, which is why we haven't like made them go away. But but that's a different problem than saying, you know, everyone's hiding. But organizations like their secrecy generally. So you want to have individuals that are not going to give up the organization. So if you're an organization recruiting individuals, who do you want? I mean, do you want the dregs of society? Or do you want like these professionals that are somewhat educated, fairly motivated, and they're generally not motivated by money, but they're motivated more by, you know, ideological reasons. And these can be religious in nature, these can be social in nature, these can be nationalist in nature. You know, in fact, for the longest period of time, the organization that had the most suicide bombings in the world was not religious. It's the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. The nationalist organizations did not use religion to motivate individuals. It was all this idea of the Tamil nation. And they also happen to be severely oppressed by the Sinhalese government. But it was a nationalist ideology, not a religious ideology. And they were the leading suicide bombers for, I mean, from 1987 up until basically in the last 5 years. And then they've been surpassed. The other problem about money as a recruitment is that means they can be outbought. Right? If all you care about is money, and you're getting paid X, and the government says, well, I'll pay you X plus $1, or whatever it is, you have people that defect. Israel's been really good at doing this. So Mossad's very good about finding individuals that are motivated purely by money and turning them. So organizations don't want to get people purely motivated by money, because those are the members that will like say, oh, well, you'll pay me more. In fact, there's this story following 9/11 where, you guys familiar with FARC? So, Fuerzas Armed, I'll remember. Yeah, they're the Colombians, but I was trying to remember what it actually, it's Fuerza.
Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia.
Thank you, yeah, my Spanish is not as good anymore, I don't remember as much. So FARC just has these landmark deals going on with the Colombian government. FARC, not generally a bunch of good guys, fairly bad. I mean, if I was to put them on a scale 1 to 10, they'd probably be at least an 11, like not good people. So after 9/11, the FARC leadership says, hey, that's a pretty interesting tactic of flying planes into buildings. Maybe we could do that. And so they actually set out this policy, this plan to fly a plane into the Colombian capital, their version of the White House, to kill President Uribe on his inauguration day. And they try this. And they actually put ads out that they're going to pay any pilot willing to do this. I think it was $2 million. And they were not successful. And you might think, well, that's probably understandable, right? I mean, what's the reality you'd be able to find a pilot, you know, that would be willing, you know, to die, or you'd even find pilots at all, because I mean, that's a tough skill. Except FARC gets a lot of their money from the drug cartels. And if any organization would have a Rolodex of pilots that they could probably like say, hey, you willing to do it for $2 million? They went down the Rolodex, no one willing to do it. So a lot of times money is not the end-all factor, and there's other things that are more to that. So that's, I think ideology is the biggest one, and that's normally what organizations want. So even if there are individuals that are willing to do for money, organizations a lot of times don't choose those individuals to do it because they're too easy to defect. There's a question over here. Yes, sir.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first is, what do you expect for the future of ISIS after the Battle of Mosul and the Battle of Raqqa, which is
Okay, so after Mosul and after Raqqa. Okay, so I expect ISIS to, I expect that we'll be successful in Mosul. I mean, I think that just out of sheer momentum, just sheer mass, that Iraq's going to take Mosul. It may be a little bit longer than maybe they want, although, I mean, there seems to be some, I mean, my discussions with them is they're actually moving faster than they thought they would. The concern is really Raqqa, because the problem is that what you have going in Mosul is you've got a lot of resources. I mean, you've got the Iraqi army. I mean, they've got a ridiculous amount of forces just crushing Mosul from all sides. I mean, and as part of the problem is they're really made up of 6 different armed forces. I mean, you've got the Iraqi army and all of their counter-terrorist efforts. You've got 2 different Sunni nationalist groups, some from Nineveh province, and then some from like Al-Anbar province that have just come to like join the fight. They're like, hey, we hate ISIS too. We're going to join in. You've got the popular mobilization units coming from the Shia. You've got the U.S. forces that are there on the ground, and then you also have like some local armed groups like Yazidis and Christians that are there that are also in the fight. So you've got like 6 groups that are all fighting around Mosul. They'll be successful at getting ISIS gone. But what I think is I think it's going to be very hard to maintain the peace because the problems that existed in Mosul beforehand are still going to exist afterward. And I think that's part of the reason why the Iraqi government's not in any rush to get rid of ISIS, because I think they're still trying to figure out what does life look like in Mosul after ISIS is gone. It's the problem we face that problem. You rush to the capital, you get there, and then all of a sudden it's like, now what? So unless you have a really good plan for afterward, it doesn't really matter if you take Mosul today or you take it a month from now. There's no reason to rush to failure. But I think we'll do it. Raqqa is the harder one because there's no mass that exists like it does in Iraq right now. I mean, who's the large force that's going to go into Raqqa? I mean, is it the Syrian army? I mean, maybe. I don't know. I don't think so. Is it going to be the YPG units? I mean, the Iraqi army is not going to continue across the border and go to Raqqa. I mean, although that would be a way, I don't see them doing that. So I think that you're going to have a part of ISIS probably stay in Raqqa for a while. And I don't know I think that's the big question from a policy perspective is who is the right force to go into there that has the resources and the political will to do it? I mean, obviously the U.S. could do it, but we're not a long-term solution. So I think that's the challenge. And I don't know what the solution is. So I think that I don't know what the after Raqqa is going to be. I mean, I think that what you're more likely to get is some other splinter groups that will pop up in Mosul. You'll have a bunch of infighting, but you'll go back to this kind of low level of violence, which is acceptable. It's just going to be there. This crime that exists in U.S. cities is just going to be kind of there. Okay, I'm going to go to the gentleman in blue, and then I don't know who's got the mic. Oh, sorry, you had another question. Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
I'll try to answer this one shorter.
Sorry, just one second. Do you think that the competitive type of international terrorism that's going on between ISIS and Al-Qaeda will increase Al-Qaeda's prominence again in the near future?
I mean, it could. I mean, that's the outbidding story, right? So is ISIS doing attacks because it's trying to get the West to capitulate, or is it doing attacks to try to draw recruits away from Al-Qaeda? And the same thing for Al-Qaeda. So I don't think necessarily it's going to increase. I mean, you could get if ISIS goes away and they don't no longer seem legitimate, Al-Qaeda could say, hey, remember us? We're still legitimate. Like, you want to join? You want to fight the West? Join us. I mean, that could happen. You could also get a third party that joins up too. So I don't know exactly. Okay. Whoever's got, I don't know. Okay.
What do you think ISIS' long-term goal is? And do you know if they recruits, are they all Muslim or non-Muslim that become Muslims? Or do you have to be a Muslim in order to be what?
So my understanding is that, I mean, that their longstanding goal is to establish the caliphate, which would initially start in, basically the Levant area, and then I mean, they'd be happy to spread it out. I mean, so I think that's their goal. So I mean, they're living it out. In fact, this was the whole distinguishing between what they did and what bin Laden did, which was bin Laden said, hey, we want to establish a caliphate, but you need to get rid of the West first. Like, the West needs to get out of the Middle East, then we can establish it. They did the reverse. They said, no, we're just going to set it up now. And that's why a lot of the Al-Qaeda folks were shaking their head like, you idiots, you can't set up the state now. Like, the U.S. is still there. Like, all they're going to do is punch you in the nose. But they did. So I think they're living out their long-term goal right now. I mean, I think that's it. It's just, it may not work out the way they wanted to. The second question was, in terms of the recruits, do they have to be Muslim? Is that what you said? I think they've got to convert. I mean, I don't. I think. I mean, that's my understanding. Is I mean, I think anyone that joins and says, "Hey, I want to be part of ISIS," and they show up, like I think they're like, "Hey, you got to change your ways." I know there's been reports about people that try to go there, and it doesn't work out for them. Meaning, like they go to apply to ISIS, they knock on the door and say, "Hey, I heard you have an opening," and ISIS says, "No, thanks," and they send them away, or they kill them, and they're just like, just get out, get out of our hair. So I knew there's some of that going on as well. Who do you want me to go to? Okay, sorry, you have the mic.
Hey, like throw all the way back to when we were talking about like terrorism and
Yep.
everything like showing up in lands of poverty.
Yeah.
Like what about homegrown terrorism? Like
Okay.
the people that bombed the bar in Florida or the Boston Marathon
Okay.
in the name of ISIS. Like how does that, I understand there's poverty in America, but
Yeah.
how does that happen?
So interestingly, the studies that do the more structural analysis, like the big data, like looks at all the factors, find that poverty is not positively correlated with terrorism. Now that's a little bit of a misnomer, and that's partly because I would like to submit I would like to call it a spectrum of violence. So this is violence, and so when you have, and we're going to put this as income in a country, like GDP, right? So in economy. So at like these high levels of income, the state's able to have a pretty good police force and security force. So when there's violence, what do we call it? We call it terrorism. At these lower levels of income, the state doesn't have a very good police force, military's not very good, there's still violence. What do we call that? War. Still violence, just we call it different things. So terrorism actually at the higher poverty levels doesn't occur. But what you do have is you have individuals which feel dissatisfied. And so, in fact, one of the things I have here, Freedom House, they rank countries by repression level. They have a number of codings, like goes 1 to 7, 7 being really, really bad, 1 being the United States. I think I actually have these on the backup side, so I can show you. Let's see. So like suicide bombings. So when you look at repression levels, this is a 15-year span, so it ended in 2005. But you find that like countries with like really, really good civil liberties, like things are really good, low levels of repression, don't get attacked very much with suicide bombing. Those ones that are really, really high, like countries like 5 and 6, this is like, you're basically like Chechnya sort of places. Israel, in terms of repression levels on Palestinian populations, levels are higher. You do get a little bit of a decrease here at the very end. My argument for that is that that's because these states are such police states that you just don't get a lot of terrorism in general. This is like your China's. It's like, there's not a lot of suicide bombings there. Yeah, but there's not a lot of bombings. In fact, when you take the two as a percentage of each other, which is here, you actually find it goes up. So as a percentage of overall attacks, suicide bombings go up as your repression level goes up higher. And I think that has to do. So I think it's more about individual perceptions of repression. And this is the problem when you have folks like, at the nightclub, is that these little T-truths are really hard to combat. Like, how do I stop every single individual that feels they're wronged? I mean, if my kids, who, God love them, but they feel they've been wronged by me because I took away their cell phone for, a night, and they're mad about that. I mean, it's like, try to give them a world perspective and say, your life is so good, you have nothing to complain about. Like, I've been to some really bad places in the world where they have nothing. But my kids don't understand that. And the same thing about homegrown terrorism. People don't, that's their own little world. And so it's that little T-truth to try to affect. Yep. Or, I'm sorry, you've got the mic here, and then I'll go here. I'll get you next. Go ahead.
My question was, do you think that, in a way, governments allow terrorism to happen in the sense of to control the population, the people, in a way that we can protect you, and also that for them not to revolt. Like, don't revolt because this will happen. Also, when something like this happens, you need us. Because if you don't have us, then these people will kill you. So in a sense, they allow it to give them security.
So I understand the question is, would a government allow terrorism to occur to make themselves feel stronger and create a need for the government? I think it goes back to the conspiracy question. I would like to think no. I mean, could it happen? I guess potentially, but I will tell you in my 20 years of service, I've never, in any operation I've been in or anything I've been involved in, we've ever said we want something bad to happen, so it makes us have a purpose for being there. And most time, I think, when it talks about terrorism, I think generally the feeling is we want to work ourselves out of a job. So I mean, I guess it could, but I think it would be, I don't know. I would be really, I would be surprised if that's actually the case.
One last part, because I was thinking, well, because with terrorism comes war in a way, so that adds more money to the jobs to the country, and also, I was gonna put in an analogy like, a mother bear with a cub, the child wants to be, its own person because they know nothing out there can harm them.
Right.
But if they know something out there that can harm them, knowing their mom can protect them, they wouldn't do certain things.
I mean, there's always the potential that someone's going to exaggerate or accentuate dangers in order to gain profits. Whether it's the Department of Defense saying, hey, you really, really need to give us more money because we need to protect ourselves from some big bad threat, or it's the Education Department saying, hey, our kids are not really doing very well, so we need more money, or the roads departments, Department of Interior saying we need more money because we need to fix our roads, or whatever. I mean, there's always that possibility. But I think in terms of actually allowing, like if we knowingly allow something to happen, I don't know. I would like to believe that's not the case. I've never at least seen any indications of that. Yeah.
Okay, so I have like two questions.
Okay.
In regards to her question about homegrown terrorism, do you find that like the homegrown terrorists are more like outliers where they also have like mental health issues and they are also like not your typical person in general, not necessarily just like,
So the way I'd answer that is I think there's two different types. So you have homegrown terrorists that are recruited by an organization, and then you have some that just decide to do things completely on their own. And I think the evidence is still, because this do it completely on your own is kind of a new phenomenon, I don't think we really know. And a lot of times they're dead, so it's hard to know. This is the Mark Sageman and Martha Crenshaw have done a lot of individual analysis. From the organizations generally try to go away from those individuals because they're too risky. They don't want them. Organization wants things to be controlled. They don't want the loose cannon that can, go crazy one day or whatever else. So generally, I think from an organization, but it's possible that their, mental health could be a factor that could play into it.
Okay. And so my second question is that the term ISIS infers that they're have to do with the religion of Islam, right? And so, amongst Muslims like myself who are against violence and terrorism and stuff like that, it's like almost not offensive, but it's like we don't want to be associated with them in that term. We don't want to give them the satisfaction of being called the Islamic State when we believe that they are not. So there's a term in Arabic that is Daesh, I'm sure you've heard of that, right? Which is actually an acronym for the same thing that ISIS means, but it also has another meaning, which means basically deplorable people, right? So why do you think it is that the United States government still refers to them as ISIS and gives them that satisfaction of?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So I think it has to do with the audience piece. So So my friends that are in the military that have been in Saudi Arabia recently, a good friend of mine just got back he was working at the embassy in Baghdad. Daesh was the term. So that's what they used. So no one used it as ISIS, they used Daesh because that was the audience there in terms of that local community. I think the reality is that the term is so much in the vernacular that trying to convince the American audience to call it something, we have a hard enough time doing that. I think it's just a battle that at the government level, they said it's just not worth the effort. Like everyone's already labeled in this, whether it's right or wrong, that's just the term that's been used. But I do think about, about how much legitimacy we give it or how much we attribute ISIS to Islam is an issue. And so I have found that, as part of that narrative, that I do think we need to separate because, having spent a good amount of time in Afghanistan, a good time in Iraq, I think there is I do think they represent a minority, a very small minority. And this is the piece that we try to, when we go back to my really poorly drawn, group here, is I wrote this one person in the middle, right? But in reality, this is like everyone, right? Most of the people are all in the middle, or they're all on the good side. Your number of the people that are actually supporting these, people here are very small. It's a very, and the reason why we knew it's a very small fraction is because if it wasn't, we would be having daily much worse problems than we do. Most of these people here just, they just want to live their life, raise their kids, do good things. And so that's the hard part, is how do we get rid of this person here, these people here, without harming them? And that's hard.
Don't you think that explaining to if we made an initiative to explain to American civilians that calling them ISIS it's feeding their ego, and if you want to not give them that satisfaction and call them something else, then is it because that's so tied to the
Well, I think they actually made an effort. So I think it was about 18 months ago, there was an effort done. I'm not saying it was done well, and I totally appreciate your point. I think they made an effort, and it just wasn't getting the traction. In fact, I think the president even tried to use the term. People started using the terms, and it just became, not to denigrate it down to reaction of the audience, but I think it just didn't get a lot of play. And now, if you kind of look at the general political sphere, is at least probably half the population of the country, at least based on you say split Democrat Republican, seems to want to label it even more than we've already done. So, but I appreciate your point, and I think that is tough. I think that is a tough piece. Yes, sir.
You said you were in Ramadi,
Yes.
03 and 04.
Yeah.
Since that was before the release of FM 3-24, how did you guys, what was the early counterinsurgency effort? What did that look like in 2004 Ramadi? Key leader engagement, presence patrols, targeting leadership in the area. How did that look like for you guys?
So were you there at some point?
No, I've studied counterinsurgency for quite some time.
Oh, okay. So it was interesting. So in Ramadi in 03 and 04, it was there was a lot less controls. We just kind of discovery learned a lot of stuff. We tried a lot of things. My previous experience was in Kosovo, so I kind of used my Kosovo model, which was try to build network diagrams of all the people. My area in Ramadi, I had the northern part of the city. So the way the city works is you've got the river that comes down, Euphrates River comes down and splits, and then the city is right here, and then the northern part of the city is all this. So I had all of that for my unit. We had about 200,000 people and about 1,000 square kilometers that my unit I was responsible for. And what we did is we tried to meet people. So a lot of times when you do counterinsurgency efforts, you target bad guys, right? That's what you should go do. Go find the bad guys and go do stuff. That's really hard to do because normally bad guys don't say, I'm a bad guy when you're talking about insurgencies. So what I told my units to do was to go find good people. I said, I want you to go find all the good people, and we're going to go talk to them. We did a lot of census type information, I want you to have conversations. And we started building this diagram. So we found out hey, maybe this area here belonged to this tribe, this area here belonged to this tribe, and we started mapping this all out. Now in the process of going out and asking all these questions and start mapping this, we would sometimes find bad guys. But that wasn't our primary purpose. Our primary purpose was to actually find good people. And that became a lot more productive for us. And so that's what we did. So I started fostering these sort of relationships, and actually I came back and I was part of the team that wrote 324. But that's kind of how we did that. And I tried to do the same thing in Afghanistan, although it was a lot harder. It was a lot easier. I didn't realize how much easier it was in Iraq than when I got to Afghanistan. It was much more difficult. Yeah. Okay, great. And if anyone's got to leave, you got class or whatever else, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you get up and you're like, I've had enough. I don't know what this Ayers guy is talking about. Yep.
Why was it hard?
It was harder for a couple of reasons. Number one is, so when I went to Kosovo, I thought life was pretty bad there. I was like, man, this is bad. People are living in really bad conditions. And then I went to Iraq, and then I was like, man, Kosovo wasn't that bad. They had power and they had running water, and it's okay, it was all right. And then I went to Afghanistan, where it is I was telling my wife one time, it is the poorest place I've ever conceived of, where people have nothing. They are living in dirt with dirt walls. You see kids that just, it is heartbreaking on a daily basis. And so because of that, it is really hard to have conversations with those people about what their goals are in life. Try to figure out what motivates them, when all that really motivates them is kind of getting from day to day. And it's hard to have conversations about them and about improving schools or improving infrastructure or improving jobs when it's when you look around, you're this is just miserable. Another part of the problem was the tribal networks in Iraq are much stronger. So in Iraq, especially in the Sunni system, you've got sheiks that run these tribes. And in control of these sheiks, you have, these sheiks kind of have city managers, they have the imams that work really for that tribe. So if I can work relationships with these sheiks, I can get a lot done. This is a Sunni, I didn't know this at the time, but this is really a Sunni phenomenon. In the Shia areas of Iraq, it's different. The sheiks have less power, and it's more about the imams have more power. And this just happens to go to their overall philosophy in terms of the religious split. In Afghanistan, these tribes were very, very weak. They didn't have, these sheiks had their own, basically private militias that would work for them. So, they had their own bodyguards, they had their own security forces. They were pretty powerful. In Afghanistan, those local tribesmen had very little to protect themselves. And so this kind of a history of banditry which existed, where you have bandits that can come in, can take from a village, can tax them, can extort them for money, and then leave, was kind of the norm. And so to try to get these local tribes to kind of give us information, be willing to help us or help themselves, they were like, look, that's not the way it works here. Whereas in Iraq, it was different. In fact, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, I didn't know this at the time, I found it afterward, through these conversations, but Saddam Hussein actually didn't get rid of the tribes. What he did was he got rid of certain sheiks and put in sheiks that were loyal to him, and they called these guys the 1990 sheiks, or the Toyo sheiks. Anyone know Toyo tires? They're like these really crappy tires. But that's what they told me. I don't have Toyo tires, but that's what they would tell me. They were like the Toyo tires. It was like they had these fake sheiks. They're the 1990 sheiks. And they basically ran Al-Anbar province for Saddam Hussein. So we didn't know this initially. So when our initial efforts went in there to get rid of the sheiks, they were like, these guys, we should get rid of them. We got a national government. We got to get the national government in charge, not get these guys in charge. We were basically undoing the system which had been working there for a long period of time. And so once we discovered that, we were like, well, why do we want to get rid of these guys when that's the system that actually works there? So let's empower them. Let's find ones that actually want to work with us. And that's what ultimately was led to the Sunni awakening, was certain sheiks that kind of banded together and they kicked Al-Qaeda out of Al-Anbar. It wasn't the government. It was these guys that did it. Yeah.
Just talking about the little T and having different perspectives.
Yeah.
As far as you think about all of the refugee children right now, and they're growing up in war zones and they're growing up without homes. So I would think their perspective would be if someone from a place like ISIL is offering them protection or saying, well, it's the West's fault that you're living in these conditions.
Yeah.
What are we doing, or what can we be doing to maybe make them realize it's not necessary?
That's a really good question. It's tough. So a lot of organizations, the way they get recruitment is through the provision of social goods. Hezbollah has done this. Hamas has done this. They provide hospitals, schools, networks. They provide the social structure. Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers did this really well. The only way to do that is to either got to legitimize the organization. So you basically take an organization that's doing that, like Hamas, and you basically turn them and you co-opt them as part of the state. So that's option number one. Option number two is you got to provide an alternate mechanism. And that's either pricey or it's not what government or a public's willing to do. Or you have to remove those children from the area and give them an alternate perspective. And that requires in countries to take those people in, which is not necessarily, it's easier said than done. But I do think it's very important. A lot of the work that's been done in Israel has talked about, I think it's Iacone, has talked about this cycle of violence. They said it's just really hard to get out of the cycle of violence, whether it's, I kill you, you kill me, I kill you, you kill me, or it's children that are grown up in those war zones.
So it's if that's all they know,
right.
They don't know that there's anything.
Well, and I'll tell you, that is one challenge that exists in when you're doing a counterinsurgency perspective, which is different than a war. So conventional wars, force on force is terrible. It is a terrible thing. It is different when you're fighting a counterinsurgency and you kill people and their families are there and they may see it. And that is a really different, or even if you don't kill them, you just take them away. It is a tough thing to go into someone's house that you've been told you need to detain X person. I'm not killing them, I'm just detaining them. And you're taking them away from their wife and their kids in front of them. And then you have to think later on, you go, what is that kid going to grow up and think about us? I know it's a bad dude. He's a bad person. We found evidence. We know he's bad. I mean, I'm not even taking the possibility that we're wrong, but let's say we're right. Those kids see that? I mean, how can I feel, they're going to grow up hating me. They're going to grow, I would hate me. So that's tough to do. And I don't know I think that's part of the problem. And ultimately why we want to try to find alternate mechanisms and not just go in and just try to kill people or try to arrest people. I mean, sometimes it's what we have to do, but I know we also had a thing that in my units, we said we never, if we had to detain someone, we always did it away from families. I said, look, we're going to go in there, we're armed and everything else. We don't need, the first couple ones we did, when I was a company commander in Iraq, was we went through very kinetically, go into a house very hard, grab the guy up, scoop him up, take him outside and everything else. But after a couple, seeing families' reactions to that, it was like, we don't need to do that. Like it got to the point where I could literally knock on a door. They knew who I was. I would say, I need you to come outside. They would come outside. I would say, hey, you're going down for questioning, or we have this evidence on you. You can either resist or not, but it's going to happen. And they would quietly get in the vehicle. Nothing would get broken, no harm. And they would, I would detain them away. It also got to the point where I had relationships with the sheikhs that I would just tell sheikhs that I need certain people brought to me. Sometimes I wouldn't detain them. Sometimes I would just question them. But I think that's a big piece is, what is that narrative and what is the informational piece you want to put to this? So it's a very tough question. I say, like saying, being in Afghanistan, it is like crushing to see kids grow up in that. In Syria, it would be equally. I haven't been there, but I can imagine it's tough.
And then a second question that is kind of on the same lines. When we went into Iraq in, I think it was 2003, what was the end goal then?
So I think the end, yeah.
After we invade, what was the next? What was our plan with the country?
That's a great question. So I think the initial objective was to get rid of what was perceived to be a strategic capability of Iraq to threaten our interests in the region. So that was the initial goal, and I think we achieved that. What was not well planned out and executed was the what's next, and I think that's part of our pause with what happened with Syria afterward or other countries is when you get rid of the established government, then you inherit a problem, and I don't there's a lot of literature that talks about it. There were plans that were done up with what after, but they weren't executed well. And there were a couple key decisions that were made, such as disbanding the Iraqi army, which in retrospect was that was probably not a good plan. But we were really concerned about that, and so that was felt to be, hey, that would be the right way to go. It was interesting because initially, there was this idea in Iraq in 2003 that we don't want any former Iraqi army people to be having any jobs of responsibility. And it didn't take very long for us to switch. I was I'm happy with if you've got Iraqi army experience. That means you've got some leadership experience. People in the police force, I thought it was ridiculous. Okay, so we want to hire a police force, but we don't want anyone to have any experience being in the military or in the police beforehand? It was this doesn't seem to be a good plan. Initially.
That pushed the people that were in leadership positions that were trying to do good things, that would push them into non-state organizations.
Right, so a lot of times it did. Yeah, so I was kind of hey, people have conversations. They were hey, I was in the Fedayeen. It's okay, you're not now. At a certain point, we've got to grow up, and I got to be 4 months ago, we were trying to kill you, but I'm not now. And I can either come to that realization that I'm no longer at war with the Iraqi army now, or I can do it 4 years from now. So I think that's part of moving on and being hey, we're not. But that is a very tough question, and I don't think we executed it completely well. Okay, no problem. Hey, thank you very much. I think Brian's got my contact information. If there's any questions that you wanted to ask that we didn't get to and you want to ask me, feel free to send them to me. I will be happy to answer and give you my thoughts on it. And other than that, I really appreciate the opportunity to come down and talk with you guys. Thank you.